Part 1: The Unraveling. Isabella stepped off the crowded street, her high heels clicking against the rain-slicked pavement, the distant hum of the city falling away behind her. The office building where she spent long hours battling legal cases loomed in the distance, its cold glass reflecting the stormy night sky. Despite the success she had achieved, the victories in court, and the admiration from her peers, there was a lingering emptiness gnawing at her soul. Something was missing, something she couldn't quite name. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the chilly wind biting through the fabric. It was nearly midnight, and the streets had emptied of their usual hustle. The darkness seemed to wrap around her like a velvet cloak, concealing her from the world she so carefully crafted. Tonight, though, something felt different. There was an energy in the air, a pull she couldn't ignore. Isabella found herself walking aimlessly, her legs carrying her further away from her usual path. Her polished life had begun to feel like a prison, each day blending into the next, predictable and controlled. Her days were spent in courtroom battles, wielding words like weapons. But lately, she felt disconnected from everything, as if her world had become too tight, too small. As she wandered deeper into the maze of city streets, she noticed an unfamiliar alleyway ahead, half hidden in shadow. A faint glow spilled from the cracks of an old wooden door, a sound of distant music drifting toward her. The sign above the door was barely legible, the letters weathered by time. It read, "Midnight." Isabella hesitated, her heart racing in her chest. This wasn't her world. She was used to upscale bars and lounges, places where the city's elite gathered. But there was something about this place, something that whispered to her curiosity. Maybe it was the promise of something different, something unpredictable. Without overthinking it, she stepped forward. The door creaked as it opened, and Isabella was immediately enveloped in the sultry warmth of the club. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different from the cold, rain-soaked streets. Velvet curtains hung from the walls, the lighting dim and golden, casting shadows that danced across the room. A low, pulsating beat filled the space, and the patrons, scattered around in clusters, seemed to move with an effortless elegance that made the place feel alive. Isabella moved cautiously through the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. It wasn't a large place, but it had an air of exclusivity. The crowd here was different, not the polished professionals she was used to. These were people who didn't need to impress, who carried an aura of mystery. As she approached the bar, a figure caught her eye. At first, she could only make out the shape of a man, tall and commanding, sitting in the shadows at the far corner. He was watching her. Isabella's breath caught. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her skin tingle with anticipation. She pretended not to notice and ordered a drink, feeling his eyes on her the entire time. The bartender, a woman with striking blue eyes and a knowing smile, handed her a glass of wine. "You're new here," the bartender said, her voice smooth and low. Isabella nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The atmosphere here felt different, more intimate, like stepping into another world where the rules no longer applied. As she sipped her drink, Isabella stole another glance at the man in the corner. He hadn't moved, but his eyes, those dark, intense eyes, were locked on her. There was a challenge in his gaze, one that sent a thrill through her body. She turned away, pretending to focus on the music, but the tension between them was undeniable. It was as though the entire room had faded into the background, leaving only the two of them. She knew, in that moment, that her life was about to change. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally stood and walked toward her. His movements were fluid, graceful, like a predator approaching its prey. He was taller than she had imagined, his dark hair slightly tousled, his sharp jawline softened by the golden glow of the lights. He exuded power and confidence, the kind that made her pulse quicken. When he reached her, he leaned against the bar, his gaze never wavering from hers. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice deep and smooth, with a hint of amusement. Isabella raised an eyebrow, refusing to be intimidated. "And what makes you think that?" The man smirked, his eyes glinting with something dark and dangerous. "You don't strike me as someone who comes to places like this." "I didn't know places like this existed," she admitted, feeling a strange compulsion to be honest with him. His smile widened, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it recognition? Interest? Whatever it was, it sent a thrill through her. "You intrigue me," he said, his voice dropping lower, almost a whisper. Isabella felt her heart race, a rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, this raw intensity. Men usually treated her with respect, admiration even, but this was different. This was primal. "I get that a lot," she said, trying to regain her composure, though she knew her voice had wavered slightly. The man chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "I'm sure you do." He extended a hand. "Damien." Isabella hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. His touch was warm, firm, sending a spark of electricity up her arm. "Isabella," she said, her voice steadier now. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They stood there, hands touching, eyes locked, and Isabella felt the world around them disappear. It was as if the entire club had vanished, leaving only the two of them, suspended in time. Damien was the first to break the silence. "You don't seem like someone who's easily impressed, Isabella." "I'm not," she said, her voice firmer now. "But I am curious." "About me?" Damien asked, his voice teasing. "About this place," she said, gesturing to the room around them. "And you?" Damien's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the playful banter between them faded, replaced by something more intense, more dangerous. "This place isn't for everyone," he said softly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "But something tells me you're not like everyone." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, that made her feel as though he could see right through her, past the carefully constructed facade she had built around herself. Before she could respond, Damien stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I have a feeling," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the music, "that you've been searching for something. Something you can't find in your perfect little world." Isabella's heart raced, his words striking a chord deep within her. He was right. She had been searching, though she hadn't realized it until now. But what was it she was looking for? And why did it feel like Damien might have the answer? "I don't know what you mean," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Damien smiled, but it wasn't the playful smirk he had worn earlier. This was something darker, more knowing. "Yes, you do." For a moment, Isabella was at a loss for words. There was something about this man, something about this place, that unnerved her. It was as though he could see the parts of her she kept hidden, the parts she was too afraid to confront. "I should go," she said suddenly, pulling away from him. But Damien didn't move. He just watched her, his gaze never leaving hers. "You can leave, Isabella," he said softly. "But you'll be back." She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, she turned and hurried toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, she took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. But as she walked away from midnight, she couldn't shake the feeling that Damien was right. Something about him had awakened a part of her she had long buried. And as much as she tried to deny it, she knew one thing for certain: she would be back. Part 2: The Return. The days after Isabella's first encounter with Damien felt like a blur. She went through the motions at work, meetings, case filings, courtroom appearances, but her mind was elsewhere. The structured, perfectly organized life she had built for herself was beginning to feel more like a cage. Each day, the nagging thought of midnight and the mysterious man who had captured her attention gnawed at her, pulling her back toward the unknown. She couldn't deny it anymore. She needed to go back. It was a Wednesday night when she made the decision. The city was bathed in the amber glow of streetlights as Isabella found herself walking down the same narrow alleyway, her heart pounding in her chest. The sign for midnight flickered dimly in the distance, like a beacon drawing her in. She had told herself she was just curious, that it was harmless. But deep down, she knew there was something more. Something had changed the night she met Damien, something inside her that she couldn't ignore. When she reached the door, her hand hesitated for only a moment before she pushed it open. The same warm, intimate atmosphere greeted her, the music pulsing softly through the room. It was as if nothing had changed, but this time, Isabella felt different. She wasn't just a curious stranger anymore, she was someone who had been called back. The bartender from before smiled knowingly as she approached, her blue eyes gleaming with recognition. "Back so soon?" she asked, her voice lilting. Isabella gave a small, sheepish smile, unsure of what to say. "I couldn't stay away." The bartender chuckled softly, sliding a glass of wine across the bar. "It happens to a lot of people who come here. This place has a way of pulling you in." Isabella took a sip of the wine, her nerves settling slightly as she glanced around the room. The crowd tonight was different, smaller, more intimate, but the same air of mystery hung in the air. Her gaze instinctively scanned the corners, searching for him. Damien. He wasn't there. She felt a strange sense of disappointment, but also relief. Had she really come back just for him? Was that what this was all about? She wasn't ready to admit that to herself just yet. As the night wore on, Isabella found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the club. The music, the drinks, the low hum of conversation, it all felt strangely comforting, like she was in a world separate from her own. A place where the expectations of her life didn't exist. But just as she began to let her guard down, she felt it, a presence behind her, a sensation so strong it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Slowly, she turned, her breath catching in her throat. Damien stood there, his dark eyes locked onto hers, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I knew you'd be back," he said, his voice smooth and low. Isabella's heart raced as she met his gaze, the familiar pull between them stronger than ever. She couldn't deny it anymore. There was something about him that drew her in, something she couldn't explain. "I'm not sure why I came back," she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. Damien's smirk widened slightly as he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Aren't you?" Isabella swallowed hard, the air around them charged with tension. There was something about the way he looked at her, the way his presence filled the room, that made her feel both vulnerable and exhilarated. "Let's not play games," Damien said, his voice dropping lower. "You're here because you want more than the life you've been living." Isabella's breath caught. His words cut through her defenses, striking at the core of what she had been trying to avoid. But she couldn't deny it. The life she had so carefully built, the success, the control, it wasn't enough anymore. "I don't even know you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to know me," Damien replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "What you're feeling right now has nothing to do with knowing. It's instinct. It's desire." Isabella's pulse quickened, her mind racing to keep up with the intensity of the moment. There was a part of her that wanted to turn and walk away, to retreat back to the safety of her perfectly controlled world. But another part, a stronger part, wanted to see where this would lead. "You don't even know what I want," she said, her voice defiant, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. Damien's eyes darkened, his expression growing more serious. "I know exactly what you want, Isabella. You want to be free." Her breath hitched in her throat. The way he said her name, the certainty in his voice, it sent a shiver down her spine. He was right. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into the mold of who she thought she should be, always in control, always perfect. But now, standing in front of Damien, in this shadowy, intoxicating world, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. The desire to let go. "And what if I do?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the music. Damien stepped closer, so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. "Then I'll show you what it's like to surrender." Isabella's heart pounded in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had never met anyone like Damien before, someone who saw through her, who understood the parts of herself she kept hidden. And as much as it terrified her, it also thrilled her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them, standing on the edge of something dangerous, something irresistible. Finally, Isabella nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Show me." Damien's eyes flashed with something dark and intense, a smile playing on his lips. Without another word, he took her hand and led her toward the back of the club, where a set of velvet curtains concealed a hidden doorway. As they passed through the doorway, the music and lights of the club faded behind them, replaced by the low hum of a different kind of energy. The air was thick with anticipation, the darkness enveloping them like a secret. Isabella's heart raced as Damien led her down a narrow corridor, the walls lined with rich, red velvet. She didn't know where they were going, but she didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive, completely, utterly alive. At the end of the corridor, Damien pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a dimly lit room. The space was intimate, with low lighting and deep, plush furniture. The air was thick with the scent of incense, creating an atmosphere that was both sensual and mysterious. Damien released her hand, his gaze never leaving hers as he crossed the room to stand by the window. The city lights cast a faint glow across his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. "You can leave, if you want," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "But if you stay, you have to be willing to let go of everything you think you know." Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, her mind racing. Everything about this moment felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. But at the same time, it felt more real than anything she had ever experienced. The safety, the control, the predictability of her life, all of it seemed so far away now, like a distant memory. And for the first time, she realized she didn't want to go back. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice steady despite the wild beating of her heart. Damien's gaze softened slightly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good." With that, he crossed the room in a few quick strides, his presence commanding and overwhelming. When he reached her, he took her face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. Isabella's pulse raced as his thumb traced the line of her jaw, his dark eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Isabella swallowed hard, her body trembling with anticipation. "Yes." Without another word, Damien leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both soft and demanding. The world around them disappeared as Isabella surrendered to the moment, to the feeling of his touch, to the fire that ignited between them. There was no turning back now. Part 3, Into the Unknown. Isabella's breath was shallow, the warmth of Damien's kiss lingering on her lips. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, yet so alive. Everything about this felt reckless, dangerous, even, but that only heightened the thrill. Damien pulled back slightly, his gaze searing into hers, as if searching for something deeper within her, something she had long buried. "Close your eyes," he whispered. Isabella hesitated, her body buzzing with nervous energy. But she did as he said, shutting out the dim lights, the heady scent of incense, and the pull of the city outside. She could only feel Damien's presence, the heat radiating from him, the tension between them stretching like a taut string. A moment passed, then another, and suddenly, the world seemed to shift. Isabella felt a gentle pressure against her wrist, and when she opened her eyes, she saw that Damien had tied a delicate silk ribbon around her arm. The sensation was soft, barely noticeable, but the symbolism behind it was undeniable. "You need to trust me," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. Isabella swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She had never been one to trust easily. In her world, trust was earned, sometimes through years of shared battles and hard-fought victories. But this was different. Damien wasn't asking for trust in the conventional sense. He was asking her to trust in something deeper, her own desires, her instincts, and the parts of herself she had long kept hidden. "Do you?" Damien asked, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was a challenge there, but also something more. It was as if he already knew the answer but was waiting for her to admit it to herself. Isabella took a deep breath. "Yes," she whispered. With that single word, she felt something inside her shift. It was as if a wall she had built around herself, brick by brick, was beginning to crack. Damien's gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. He took her hand again, his fingers lacing with hers, and led her further into the room. The space was small and intimate, the low lighting casting long shadows across the walls. Isabella couldn't help but feel like she was stepping into another world, one where the rules of her carefully structured life no longer applied. Damien gestured for her to sit, and Isabella sank into a plush velvet armchair, her heart racing as she watched him move across the room. He was so self-assured, so confident, as if he was completely in control of the moment. But as she watched him, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than the dark, mysterious persona he projected. "You still haven't told me what this place is," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Damien turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Midnight is more than just a club, he said, his voice low and serious. It's a place where people come to let go. To forget the world outside, even if only for a few hours. To let go of what? Isabella asked, leaning forward slightly. Damien's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the playful banter between them faded, replaced by something more intense. Whatever is holding them back. Fear. Inhibitions. Control. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. His words hit too close to home. She had spent her entire life in control of her career, her relationships, her future. But now, sitting here in this darkened room, with Damien standing so close, she realized that control was the very thing that had been suffocating her. "What are you holding on to, Isabella?" Damien asked, his voice soft, but the question cut deep. Isabella opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She didn't know how to answer that question. She had always been so focused on achieving her goals, on climbing the corporate ladder, that she had never stopped to think about what it was costing her. "You don't have to answer now," Damien said, his tone gentler now. "But you'll figure it out. Here, in this place, you don't have to be who the world expects you to be." Isabella looked away, her mind spinning. How could this stranger see her so clearly, when even she wasn't sure who she was anymore? Before she could dwell on the thought, Damien moved closer, his hand brushing against her shoulder. The simple touch sent a shiver down her spine. He leaned down, his lips close to her ear. "Let me show you something." Isabella's pulse quickened as Damien took her hand and led her toward a set of double doors at the far end of the room. She didn't know where they were going, but she didn't care. Something about this night, about Damien, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. They stepped through the doors into a space that took Isabella's breath away. It was a room unlike any she had ever seen, filled with velvet couches, soft lighting, and walls adorned with ornate tapestries. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and sandalwood, and the soft hum of music drifted through the space. Isabella turned to Damien, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is this place?" "This is where people come when they're ready to let go," Damien said, his voice low and steady. "Let go." The words echoed in her mind, reverberating with a weight she hadn't fully understood until now. She had been holding on for so long, holding on to expectations, to control, to the need to prove herself. But here, in this hidden world, those things didn't matter. Damien guided her toward a plush couch, and they sat side by side, the space between them crackling with unspoken tension. He turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. "Tell me what you're afraid of." Isabella's breath caught. No one had ever asked her that before. Fear wasn't something she was supposed to feel, not in her world. She was supposed to be strong, unshakable. But now, with Damien so close, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. "I'm afraid of losing control," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's gaze softened slightly, and he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Control is an illusion, Isabella. The more you try to hold on to it, the more it slips through your fingers." His words struck a chord deep within her, and for the first time, she realized how tightly she had been clinging to control. It had defined every aspect of her life, her career, her relationships, even her identity. But now, in this moment, she saw it for what it was, a cage. "What if I don't know how to let go?" she asked, her voice trembling. Damien's lips curled into a soft smile. "That's why I'm here." He leaned in closer, his presence overwhelming, but not in a way that made her feel small. Instead, It felt like he was drawing something out of her, something raw and powerful, something she hadn't even known was there. As his lips brushed against hers again, Isabella felt the last remnants of her resistance crumble. She didn't need to control this moment, didn't need to define it or analyze it. She just needed to be in it, to feel it, to surrender to it. The kiss deepened, and with it, the world around them seemed to blur. Time lost its meaning as Isabella gave herself over to the sensations flooding her body. Damien's touch was firm, but gentle, his hands moving with purpose, yet always respectful of her boundaries. For the first time in her life, Isabella felt free. Free from expectations, from control, from the weight of the world she had built around herself. And in that freedom, she found a part of herself she hadn't even known she was missing. As they pulled away from the kiss, breathless and flushed, Damien smiled softly, his dark eyes gleaming with something warm and tender. "Welcome to midnight, Isabella," he whispered. Part 4, The Pull of Desire. Isabella lay back against the plush velvet of the couch, her heart still racing from the intensity of the kiss. Damien sat beside her, his presence electric in the quiet intimacy of the room. For a long moment they said nothing, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. She had come here looking for something, though she hadn't known what that was until now. And in Damien, she had found a force that both terrified and thrilled her. It wasn't just the physical attraction, though that was undeniable. It was the way he seemed to see through her, to understand the parts of herself that even she hadn't fully acknowledged. It was the freedom he offered, a chance to step outside the rigid confines of her life and explore something wilder, something more dangerous. "You're thinking too much," Damien said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. Isabella glanced at him, surprised. He was right, of course. Her mind was already spinning, trying to make sense of everything, to categorize it, analyze it, control it. But that was the problem. She didn't want to control this. Not anymore. "I can't help it," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. Damien smiled, but it was a knowing smile, one that spoke of experience, of understanding. "You don't have to figure everything out, Isabella. Some things, you just feel." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. There was something about the way he said her name that made her pulse quicken, made her feel seen in a way that no one else ever had. But she was also afraid of losing herself, of stepping too far into this world, not being able to find her way back. "I don't know if I can do that," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. Damien reached out, gently lifting her chin until her eyes met his. "You can," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you think. But strength isn't about control. It's about knowing when to let go. Let go." The words echoed in her mind, reverberating through her like a distant drumbeat. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to keep everything together, to handle whatever life threw at her with grace and composure. But now, in this moment, she realized that strength wasn't what she thought it was. Strength wasn't about holding on, it was about the courage to let go. Isabella took a deep breath, her mind spinning. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being vulnerable, to admitting that she didn't have all the answers. But here, with Damien, she felt like she could. She felt like she could strip away all the layers she had built around herself and just be. "I want to," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I just don't know how." Damien's gaze softened, and for a moment, the intensity between them eased, replaced by something warmer, something more tender. "That's the beauty of it," he said gently. "You don't have to know. You just have to trust yourself." Trust. That word again. It was something she had always struggled with, not just trusting others, but trusting herself. Trusting her instincts, her desires, her emotions. But here, in this strange, intoxicating world, with Damien beside her, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien smiled, a slow, confident smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I'll show you." Without another word, he took her hand and led her back to the middle of the room. The velvet curtains around them shimmered softly in the low light, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and sandalwood, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Isabella's pulse quickened as Damien stood in front of her, his presence overwhelming yet comforting. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm, sending a jolt of electricity through her body. "Close your eyes," he whispered. Isabella hesitated for only a moment before obeying. The darkness enveloped her, heightening her other senses. She could feel Damien's warmth, the faint hum of his breath, the brush of his fingers against her skin. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, she felt him move closer, his presence filling the space between them. His hand found hers, his touch firm yet gentle, guiding her, leading her into the unknown. "Breathe," he said softly. "Just breathe." Isabella inhaled deeply, the scent of jasmine filling her lungs, calming her racing heart. She exhaled slowly, allowing herself to sink into the moment, to let go of the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind. Damien's hand moved to her waist, his fingers grazing her skin through the fabric of her dress. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She could feel the heat of his body, the tension between them building with each passing second. And then, without warning, his lips brushed against hers, soft, tentative, like a question waiting to be answered. Isabella's breath caught in her throat, her body tensing with anticipation. But instead of pulling away, she leaned into the kiss, letting herself be swept away by the sensation. The kiss deepened, and with it, the world around them seemed to blur. Isabella's mind quieted, her body taking over, guiding her movements. She wrapped her arms around Damien's neck, pulling him closer, surrendering to the moment. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking, wasn't analyzing or controlling. She was just feeling. And it felt incredible. As the kiss ended, Damien pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. They stood there for a moment, breathing in sync, their bodies still pressed together. The connection between them was palpable, electric, and Isabella felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. "See," Damien whispered. "You can let go." Isabella opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. There was a softness in his expression, a tenderness she hadn't expected. And for the first time, she realized that this wasn't just about physical attraction. There was something deeper here, something more meaningful. "I don't know what's happening," Isabella admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't want it to stop." Damien smiled, his eyes dark and intense. "It doesn't have to." He took her hand again, guiding her back to the couch. They sat together, their bodies close but not touching, the space between them filled with unspoken promises. Isabella's heart raced as she tried to process everything that had happened, but there was a part of her that didn't want to think about it. She just wanted to feel it. Damien leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "Tell me what you want," he whispered. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. It was such a simple question, but it felt impossibly difficult to answer. She had spent so much of her life focused on what she should want, on what was expected of her. But now, in this moment, with Damien so close, she realized that she didn't have to live by those expectations anymore. She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. What did she want? It was such a foreign concept to her, to think about her own desires instead of everyone else's. "I want to feel free," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's eyes darkened, and he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a thrill through her body. "Then let me show you what that feels like." Isabella's pulse quickened as Damien stood, holding out his hand. She hesitated for only a moment before taking it, allowing him to guide her back through the velvet curtains and into the hidden corridors of midnight. The air around them felt charged with possibility, with the promise of something unknown, something exhilarating. And for the first time, Isabella wasn't afraid. She was ready to embrace whatever came next. Part 5. Stepping into the darkness. The hallway was dimly lit, the soft glow of sconces casting flickering shadows along the red velvet walls as Damien led Isabella deeper into the hidden parts of midnight. Her heart raced with each step, the steady rhythm of their footsteps filling the silence between them. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a palpable tension that made every second feel like an eternity. Isabella wasn't sure what awaited her at the end of this journey, but she knew one thing for certain: she had never felt more alive. The weight of her old life, the control, the expectations, felt distant now, as though it belonged to someone else. Here, in this place, with Damien by her side, she was free to explore a side of herself she had long buried. Damien didn't speak as they walked, his hand wrapped around hers with a firm but gentle grip. The silence between them was comfortable, charged with the unspoken understanding of what lay ahead. It wasn't just about physical attraction, it was about something deeper, something primal that neither of them could ignore. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the corridor. It was made of heavy, dark wood, with intricate carvings along its edges. Damien paused for a moment, turning to face Isabella. "This is your moment," he said softly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. She was ready. More than ready. The fear she had felt earlier, the fear of losing control, of stepping into the unknown, was gone now, replaced by a burning desire to see where this path would lead. She wasn't just surrendering to Damien, she was surrendering to herself, to the parts of her that had long been denied. "I want to," she said, her voice steady despite the wild beating of her heart. Damien's lips curled into a soft smile, and with that, he pushed open the door. The room beyond was unlike anything Isabella had ever seen. It was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from dozens of candles scattered around the room, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and sandalwood, and the atmosphere was charged with an almost otherworldly energy. The room itself was expansive, with deep, plush furniture and ornate decor. At the center was a large four-poster bed, its dark wood polished to a gleam, draped with rich fabrics that shimmered in the candlelight. The walls were lined with velvet curtains, and the ceiling was adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. This place was a sanctuary, a world away from the cold, sterile environment of her office and the structured life she had lived. It was intimate, mysterious, and undeniably sensual. Damien led her inside, closing the door behind them. The quiet click of the latch seemed to seal them into this world, separating them from everything that lay beyond. Here, nothing else mattered. There were no rules, no expectations, only the raw, electric connection between them. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with anticipation. Damien's dark eyes were locked onto hers, his expression unreadable, though there was an intensity in his gaze that made Isabella's heart race. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien stepped closer, his presence overwhelming yet calming. "Now, you let go," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "You surrender to what you feel. No fear. No control. Just the moment." Isabella swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She had spent so much of her life trying to control everything, her career, her emotions, her desires. But now, in this moment, she realized that control was an illusion. It was only when she let go that she could truly experience life, that she could truly experience herself. Damien reached out, his hand gently brushing her cheek. The simple touch sent a shiver down her spine, a thrill of electricity coursing through her body. She closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth of his touch, letting the world around her fade away. "You're safe here," Damien whispered, his lips close to her ear. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself." Isabella's breath hitched, the words sinking deep into her soul. She had spent so long trying to be everything for everyone else, trying to live up to the expectations placed upon her by her career, by society, by herself. But here, in this room, with Damien, she could finally be free. Slowly, she opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. He wasn't asking her to be perfect. He wasn't asking her to be in control. He was asking her to be real. And for the first time, she was ready to give that. Without another word, Damien's hand slipped to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. His lips met hers in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as though he was giving her the chance to pull away. But Isabella didn't want to pull away. She wanted more. The kiss deepened, and with it, the tension between them grew. Damien's hands moved to her waist, pulling her against him, his touch firm but not demanding. Isabella's heart raced as she wrapped her arms around his neck, losing herself in the sensation of his lips, his hands, his presence. It was intoxicating, this feeling of letting go, of giving in to the desire that had been simmering between them since the moment they met. There was no fear now, no hesitation. Only the raw, electric connection between them, pulling them closer, deeper into the unknown. As the kiss broke, both of them breathless, Damien rested his forehead against hers, his voice a low murmur. "Tell me what you want, Isabella." Isabella's mind spun. What did she want? She had spent so long ignoring her own desires, pushing them aside in favor of what was expected of her. But now, in this moment, with Damien so close, she knew exactly what she wanted. "I want to feel alive," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the confession. Damien's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "Then let me show you." He took her hand again, guiding her toward the bed. The soft fabric of the sheets felt cool against her skin as she sat on the edge, her heart racing with anticipation. Damien stood in front of her, his presence commanding but not overpowering. Slowly, he knelt before her, his hands resting on her knees. His dark eyes held hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was something intimate, something deeply vulnerable about this moment, about the way he looked at her, as though she was the only person in the world. "You don't have to be afraid," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. She was ready. Ready to feel, ready to let go, ready to surrender. With that, Damien's hands moved up her thighs, his touch firm but gentle, sending a thrill of electricity through her body. Isabella's pulse quickened as she leaned back, letting herself be enveloped by the moment, by the sensation of his touch, by the freedom she had been searching for. And in that moment, she realized something profound. This wasn't just about desire, about physical connection. It was about her. About reclaiming the parts of herself she had long denied, about stepping into the darkness and finding the light within. As Damien's hands continued their slow, deliberate movements, Isabella closed her eyes, letting the sensations wash over her. She wasn't in control here, but that was okay. She didn't need to be. For the first time in her life, she didn't need to control anything. She just needed to feel. And in that feeling, she found a kind of freedom she had never known before. Part 6. Beneath the Surface. As the sensations coursed through her body, Isabella felt herself slipping further into the moment, her mind untethered from the constraints that had once bound her. Damien's touch was both grounding and freeing, anchoring her to the present while simultaneously allowing her to drift into a realm where nothing else mattered. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what came next or the consequences of her choices. She was simply feeling. When Damien's hands finally stilled, he rose slowly, his dark eyes filled with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension, the connection between them deeper than anything Isabella had ever experienced before. But there was something else, something beneath the surface of Damien's calm exterior, something he hadn't yet revealed. Isabella sat up slowly, her pulse still racing. As she met his gaze, she could sense the weight of everything that had passed between them, and yet, she felt a growing curiosity, an urge to know more about the man who had somehow seen her more clearly than anyone else ever had. "Why do you do this?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's expression shifted slightly, his features darkening as if her question had touched on something deeper, something hidden. He didn't answer right away, and the silence between them stretched out, heavy and thick. "What do you mean?" Damien asked, his voice low, careful. Isabella hesitated, unsure of how to phrase what she was feeling. There was something about Damien, about the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to be in control of everything, that both intrigued and unsettled her. "You seem to know so much about me," she said finally, her words slow and deliberate. "But I don't know anything about you." Damien's lips curved into a small smile, but there was no humor in it, only a shadow of something darker. He moved away from her, crossing the room to stand by the window. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the quiet intensity in his eyes. "You think you don't know me, but you do," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "You know the parts that matter." Isabella frowned, her curiosity piqued by the cryptic response. What does that mean? Damien turned to face her, his expression unreadable. It means that what you've seen of me is real. But there are parts of me, parts of my life, that I don't share easily. Isabella felt a knot of uncertainty form in her chest. She had sensed from the beginning that Damien was hiding something, that there was more to him than what he allowed the world to see. But now, she wasn't sure if she was ready to confront it. You don't have to tell me everything, Isabella said quietly, her gaze softening. But I want to understand you. Damien's eyes darkened, and for a long moment, he said nothing. The silence between them stretched out, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of whatever he carried was finally becoming too much to bear. I didn't come to this place by accident, he said, his voice low and filled with an emotion Isabella couldn't quite place. Midnight isn't just a club for me. It's an escape. Isabella's heart tightened in her chest. An escape. The word resonated deeply with her, echoing the feeling she had carried for so long but had never fully acknowledged. She had spent so much of her life running, from expectations, from fear, from herself. But she had never allowed herself to name it, to face it head-on. An escape from what? She asked softly. Damien hesitated, his gaze flicking away from hers as if the answer was too painful to speak. From my past, he said finally. From the things I've done. The admission hung heavy in the air, and Isabella felt a chill creep down her spine. She didn't know what she had expected him to say, but it wasn't this. There was a darkness in Damien, a part of him that he had carefully concealed, but now it was beginning to surface, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to see it. What things? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Damien turned back toward the window, his silhouette outlined against the soft glow of the city lights beyond. His silence spoke volumes, and for a moment, Isabella wondered if he would even answer her. But then, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost resigned. I wasn't always the man you see now, he said. There was a time when I was different. When I made choices that I can never undo. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing to make sense of his words. What had Damien done? What could be so terrible that he felt the need to escape from it? What kind of choices? She asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. Damien's eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw something raw and vulnerable in his gaze, something that made her chest tighten. He wasn't just hiding from his past, he was haunted by it. I hurt people, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I made decisions that ruined lives. And I can never take them back. Isabella's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling from the confession. She had sensed that there was something dark about Damien, something that went beyond the confident, enigmatic exterior he presented to the world. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to carry so much pain. Why are you telling me this? She asked softly. Damien looked away, his jaw tightening. Because you deserve to know the truth. And because I want you to understand why I am the way I am. Isabella stood, her legs unsteady as she crossed the room to stand beside him. She reached out, her hand gently brushing his arm. Damien, whatever you did, that's not who you are now. His gaze flicked to hers, a flicker of something, hope, crossing his features before it was quickly masked. You don't know that. Isabella stepped closer, her hand finding his. Yes, I do. I see you. The real you. And I know you're not the man you once were. For a long moment, Damien said nothing, his expression unreadable. But then, slowly, his hand tightened around hers, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. I don't deserve your kindness, he whispered. Isabella shook her head. Maybe you do. They stood there in silence, the weight of Damien's confession hanging between them. But despite the darkness that had surfaced, Isabella didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel the urge to run. If anything, she felt closer to him now, more connected than ever before. Midnight is a place where people come to forget, Damien said finally, his voice quiet. But I think I'm done forgetting. Isabella's heart swelled with emotion as she reached out, cupping his cheek in her hand. Then maybe it's time to start remembering. Damien's gaze softened, and for the first time since they met, Isabella saw the man beneath the surface, the man who had been hiding behind walls of control and secrecy. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But in this moment, she realized that they didn't have to be. They just had to be real. Without another word, Damien pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both tender and filled with the weight of everything they had shared. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, Isabella knew that this was just the beginning of something deeper, something more meaningful than anything she had ever known. Part 7, Unveiling the Truth. The kiss lingered between them, filled with a vulnerability that Isabella hadn't expected. Damien's arms held her gently but firmly, grounding her in the moment while allowing her to feel the depth of his emotions. There was something raw in the way he kissed her, something that went beyond desire. It was as if he was silently asking for her understanding, her acceptance, two things Isabella was ready to give. As they pulled away, both breathless, Damien's dark eyes searched hers, as if trying to gauge her reaction. Isabella's heart raced, but there was no hesitation now, no fear of the unknown. Instead, there was only a quiet certainty, a feeling that whatever they were stepping into together was worth the risk. You don't have to hide from me, Isabella whispered, her hand gently brushing his cheek. Not anymore. Damien closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch. I've spent so long trying to keep the past buried, he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. But now, with you, I don't want to hide. Isabella's heart tightened in her chest. She could feel the weight of his words, the gravity of the admission. Damien wasn't just opening up to her, he was showing her the most vulnerable parts of himself, the parts he had kept hidden from the world. I want to know you, Isabella said softly. All of you. Damien's eyes flicked open, and for a moment, she saw the flicker of something in his gaze, something hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether to believe her. But then, slowly, he nodded, his expression softening. There are things about my past that I'm not proud of, Damien began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Things I've done that I can't change. But meeting you, Isabella, it's made me realize that I don't have to let those things define me. Isabella reached for his hand, holding it tightly. You're not the man you were back then. Whatever happened in your past, it doesn't have to control your future. Damien smiled faintly, his fingers tightening around hers. I'm not sure how you do it, he said, his voice laced with admiration. How you make me feel like I'm worth saving. Isabella's heart ached with the tenderness of his words. She hadn't set out to save Damien. If anything, she felt like he had helped her discover parts of herself she didn't even know existed. But now, Standing here with him, she realized that maybe, in some way, they had saved each other. "You don't need saving," Isabella said quietly. "You just need someone to believe in you." Damien's gaze softened, and for a long moment, they stood in silence, the quiet intimacy between them palpable. The weight of his confession hung in the air, but instead of pushing them apart, it had brought them closer together. Isabella could feel the shift, the subtle change in the way he held her, the way he looked at her. It was as though they had crossed an invisible threshold, one that neither of them had been fully prepared for but both were ready to embrace. "I've never been good at letting people in," Damien admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But with you, I want to try." Isabella's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with emotion. She could hear the vulnerability in his words, the fear of opening up, of being seen. But she also heard the hope, the quiet yearning for something more, something real. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "I'm here. With you." Damien's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw the depth of his emotions, the struggle, the pain, but also the hope. Slowly, he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Isabella's heart swelled with emotion as she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat was comforting, grounding her in the moment. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, the quiet intimacy between them stronger than words. After a while, Damien spoke again, his voice softer now. "There's something I want to show you." Isabella pulled back slightly, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Damien gave her a small, almost shy smile, a look she hadn't seen from him before. It made her heart flutter in her chest. "Come with me," he said, taking her hand and leading her toward a door on the far side of the room. As they stepped through the doorway, Isabella felt a shift in the atmosphere. The room they entered was unlike the others, smaller, more intimate, with soft lighting and an air of serenity that contrasted sharply with the rest of midnight. In the center of the room was a large, ornately carved chest, its dark wood gleaming in the soft light. Damien led her to the chest, his expression growing more serious. "This is where I keep the things that matter most to me," he said quietly. "Things I've held on to from my past. Things that remind me of who I am." Isabella's heart raced with anticipation as Damien knelt in front of the chest, unlocking it with a small, intricate key. The lid creaked open, revealing a collection of items that seemed ordinary at first glance: photographs, letters, mementos from a lifelong past. But as Damien began to pull each item out, explaining their significance, Isabella realized just how deeply personal they were. "This," Damien said, holding up an old, worn photograph of a younger version of himself, "was taken just before everything changed. Before I made the choices that would alter the course of my life." Isabella studied the photo, her heart aching as she saw the pain in his younger self's eyes. She could see the weight of the decisions he had made, the regret that had followed him for so long. But she also saw something else, something that had survived despite it all. "You were lost," Isabella said softly, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the photograph. "But you found your way back." Damien's eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment, she saw the flicker of something raw in his gaze, something that made her chest tighten with emotion. "I'm still finding my way," he admitted, his voice low. "But I think I'm finally ready to move forward." Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with affection for this man who had bared his soul to her, who had trusted her with his pain and his past. She reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "You don't have to do it alone." Damien's fingers tightened around hers, and for the first time, Isabella saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a hope that hadn't been there before. "I know," he whispered. They spent the rest of the evening going through the contents of the chest, sharing stories, memories, and the weight of the past. As the night wore on, Isabella realized just how much she had come to care for Damien, how deeply she felt connected to him in ways she hadn't expected. By the time they finished, the room was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the weight of the past lifted, if only for a moment. Isabella leaned back against the plush cushions, her hands still intertwined with Damien's, a quiet peace settling over them. "You've shown me so much," Isabella said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But there's still more to you, isn't there?" Damien smiled, his dark eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity. "There's always more to discover." Isabella's heart fluttered in her chest as she leaned closer, her lips brushing against his in a soft, lingering kiss. As they pulled away, both breathless, she knew one thing for certain: whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. Part 8: The Ties That Bind. The quiet intimacy of the room enveloped them like a warm embrace, the weight of Damien's past now shared, the secrets no longer festering in the shadows. Isabella had seen Damien's vulnerabilities, the scars he carried, and somehow, they had brought them closer together. She had opened her heart to him, and in return, he had shown her the pieces of himself that he had long kept hidden. For a moment, they sat together in the soft glow of candlelight, the silence between them comforting rather than heavy. Isabella felt the gentle rise and fall of Damien's chest beneath her palm, his steady breathing matching her own. There was something peaceful about the way they fit together, as though they had been searching for this connection without even realizing it. "I can't believe how much has changed," Isabella murmured, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Damien turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "What do you mean?" Isabella smiled faintly, her fingers idly tracing the outline of his hand. "I came here to forget, to escape the life I'd built. But now, it's like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Damien's gaze softened, and he reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've found yourself." Isabella blinked, his words sinking in with a weight she hadn't expected. She hadn't realized it until now, but he was right. The woman she had been when she first walked into midnight was different from the one she was now. She had spent so much of her life trying to control everything, her career, her emotions, her image, that she had lost sight of who she truly was. And now, in this hidden world, with Damien by her side, she was rediscovering herself. "Maybe I have," Isabella whispered, her heart swelling with the quiet truth of it. Damien smiled, a slow, tender smile that made her pulse quicken. "I think we're both finding ourselves," he said, his voice laced with warmth. "And maybe that's why we found each other." Isabella's chest tightened with emotion. The connection between them felt undeniable, deeper than anything she had ever experienced before. It wasn't just about the passion, the desire. They had both revealed parts of themselves that they had long kept hidden, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that was stronger than either of them could have predicted. Damien shifted slightly, turning to face her more fully. "There's something else I need to tell you." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. There was a gravity in his tone that made her pulse quicken, a seriousness that told her whatever he was about to say was important. She nodded, her breath catching in her throat as she braced herself for what was to come. Damien hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking away from hers before returning with a quiet intensity. "I didn't just come to midnight to escape," he said, his voice low and careful. "I came here to find redemption." Isabella's brows furrowed in confusion. "Redemption?" Damien's jaw tightened slightly, and he nodded. "For the things I did, the choices I made. I've been trying to make up for them, in my own way." Isabella's heart ached at the weight of his words. She could hear the guilt, the pain, that he carried with him, and it made her chest tighten with empathy. She reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "You don't have to carry that burden alone, Damien." He looked at her, his expression softening. "I know. But it's not just about me anymore. I came here because I wanted to help others find what I was looking for: freedom, release, a way to move forward. That's what midnight is. It's not just a place to escape. It's a place to heal." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The club, the world that Damien had introduced her to, suddenly took on a deeper meaning. Midnight wasn't just a refuge for him, it was a sanctuary for others, a place where people came to shed the weight of their pasts and rediscover themselves. "You created this place," Isabella whispered, the realization dawning on her. Damien nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I wanted to build something that gave people the chance to let go of their pain, to find peace, just like I was trying to do. Midnight became that for so many people. But in doing so, I realized that I was still holding on to my own past." Isabella's heart swelled with emotion as she listened to him speak. The passion in his voice, the quiet determination, made her chest tighten with admiration. He had built something beautiful, something meaningful, out of his own pain and regret. And now, standing here with him, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the man he had become. "You've created something incredible, Damien," Isabella said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "You've helped so many people, including me." Damien's gaze flicked to hers, and for a moment, she saw the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, the uncertainty, the fear that maybe he hadn't done enough. But then, slowly, he smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Thank you," he whispered. Isabella leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a tender kiss. It was soft, slow, and filled with the weight of everything they had shared. When they pulled away, she rested her forehead against his, their breaths mingling in the quiet intimacy of the moment. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," Isabella said softly, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Damien's eyes darkened with emotion, and he pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her in a tight embrace. "I don't deserve you, Isabella," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isabella shook her head, her heart swelling with affection. "You deserve everything, Damien." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the quiet weight of the past finally beginning to lift. Isabella could feel the shift between them, the deepening of their bond, and it filled her with a quiet sense of peace. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone. As the candles flickered softly around them, casting long shadows across the room, Isabella realized that this was only the beginning. There was still so much to discover, about herself, about Damien, about the world they were creating together. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Part 9. Bound by trust. The following days seemed to blur together as Isabella and Damien continued to explore the depth of their connection. Every moment they spent together felt like they were peeling back layers, revealing more of their vulnerabilities and desires. The walls that Isabella had built around herself, walls of control, of self-doubt, were crumbling, leaving her exposed in a way she had never thought possible. But for the first time, she welcomed that vulnerability. Their conversations grew deeper, more intimate. Damien shared more about the people who came to Midnight, each seeking something different but ultimately looking for the same thing: freedom from the ghosts of their pasts. Isabella listened, captivated not only by the stories but by Damien's passion for the sanctuary he had created. Midnight had become more than just a refuge for him, it was a lifeline for others, and now, it was a part of her story as well. One night, as they sat together in the dim glow of candlelight, the quiet hum of the club fading into the background, Damien's expression shifted into something more serious. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, his voice low but steady. Isabella's heart skipped a beat at the sudden change in his tone. "What is it?" Damien hesitated for a moment, his fingers gently tracing the outline of her hand. "I want you to be a part of this," he said softly. "Not just as someone I care about, but as someone who understands what this place means." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She had always felt a connection to Midnight, to the world that Damien had created, but hearing him ask her to be a part of it in a more meaningful way filled her with both excitement and uncertainty. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quiet but curious. Damien's dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw the vulnerability he had tried so hard to conceal. "I want you to help me run this place," he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "To help me make it better, to bring your own strength and understanding to the people who come here." Isabella's heart raced. The idea of becoming a part of Midnight in this way was both thrilling and daunting. She had come to this place as someone seeking freedom, someone trying to escape the confines of her life, and now, Damien was offering her the chance to be a part of something bigger, something that could change lives. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Damien's hand tightened around hers, his expression softening. "You are," he said firmly. "You understand this place in a way that few people do. You've experienced what it can offer, and I believe you have the power to help others find the same freedom." Isabella swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had always been the one in control, the one who made decisions, who led others. But this was different. This wasn't about control, it was about trust. Trust in herself, trust in Damien, and trust in the people who came to Midnight seeking solace. "What if I fail?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien's gaze softened, and he reached up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle but firm. "You won't," he said quietly. "But even if you stumble, I'll be here. We'll face it together." Isabella's chest tightened with emotion as she looked into Damien's eyes. There was no judgment there, no pressure, only understanding and support. He wasn't asking her to be perfect, he was asking her to be herself, to bring her own strength and compassion to the people who needed it most. Slowly, she nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of purpose. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll do it." Damien's lips curved into a slow, genuine smile, a smile that made her heart flutter in her chest. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isabella leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a soft, lingering kiss. When they pulled away, she rested her forehead against his, her breath mingling with his in the quiet intimacy of the moment. "I won't let you down," she whispered. Damien smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "You could never let me down." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Damien introduced Isabella to the inner workings of Midnight, showing her the intricacies of running the club, from the logistics of managing the staff to the more delicate task of dealing with the people who came seeking refuge. Isabella quickly realized that Midnight was more than just a business, it was a community, a place where people could shed their burdens and find comfort in the anonymity of the dark, intimate world Damien had created. Isabella found herself thriving in this new role, her natural empathy and understanding helping her connect with the people who came to Midnight. She listened to their stories, their pain, their hopes, and slowly, she began to understand just how much this place meant to them. It wasn't just a club, it was a sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves without fear of judgment or rejection. One evening, as Isabella stood at the bar, watching the crowd mingle and dance, Damien approached her, his dark eyes gleaming with quiet pride. "You're a natural at this," he said softly, his hand resting lightly on her waist. Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with warmth at his words. "I didn't think I'd enjoy it as much as I do," she admitted. "But it feels right." Damien's gaze softened, and he leaned in to press a gentle kiss to her temple. "You were meant for this," he whispered. "For more than the life you had before." Isabella's chest tightened with emotion as she looked out at the crowd. She had spent so long trying to fit into the mold of who she thought she should be, but now, here in this place, with Damien by her side, she felt like she was finally discovering who she truly was. And it was exhilarating. As the night wore on, the energy in the club shifted. The usual hum of conversation and music gave way to a quieter, more intimate atmosphere, and Isabella found herself retreating to one of the private rooms to catch her breath. She sat down on a plush velvet couch, her mind still buzzing with the events of the evening. She had never imagined herself in this position, running a club, helping people find solace and freedom, but now, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. As she sat there, lost in thought, the door to the room creaked open, and Damien stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Isabella nodded, offering him a small smile. "Yeah, I just needed a moment." Damien crossed the room and sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her knee. "You're doing incredible things, Isabella. I don't know if I've told you that enough." Isabella's heart swelled at his words, and she turned to face him, her gaze soft. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said quietly. "You've given me so much." Damien's expression darkened slightly, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps, in his eyes. "You've given me just as much," he said softly. "More than you realize." Isabella's breath caught in her throat at the intensity of his words, and before she could respond, Damien leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was soft yet filled with the weight of everything they had shared. As the kiss deepened, Isabella felt the world around them fade away, leaving only the two of them, bound together by trust, desire, and something deeper, something that neither of them could fully name but both felt with every fiber of their being. When they finally pulled away, breathless and flushed, Damien rested his forehead against hers, his voice a low murmur. "You've changed my life, Isabella." Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. You've changed mine too. They sat there in the quiet intimacy of the moment, wrapped in each other's embrace, the future stretching out before them, filled with possibilities. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in her life, Isabella knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Part 10: A New Beginning. As the days turned into weeks, Isabella and Damien fell into a rhythm, their lives intertwined not just by their connection, but by the shared purpose they had found in Midnight. The club had become their sanctuary, a place where they could leave the outside world behind and focus on the things that truly mattered: each other, the people they were helping, and the deeper sense of freedom they had both discovered. Isabella had never imagined that her life could take such a turn. The woman who had once thrived on control, structure, and rigid expectations was now someone who embraced the unknown, who found peace in letting go. Midnight had not only changed her life, it had opened her eyes to the possibilities of what life could be when she allowed herself to live without boundaries. Damien, too, had changed. The weight of his past no longer held him captive, and with each passing day, he seemed to let go of the guilt and pain he had carried for so long. His once guarded nature had softened, allowing him to open up not only to Isabella but also to the people who came to Midnight seeking solace. He was no longer just the enigmatic man who ran the club, he was someone who had found redemption through the very thing he had created. One evening, as the club hummed with its usual energy, Isabella stood by the entrance, watching as people drifted in and out, their faces filled with the same quiet anticipation she had once felt. There was something magical about this place, something that went beyond the physical walls. Midnight had become a beacon for those who needed a place to escape, to heal, to find themselves. And she was proud to be a part of it. As she stood there, lost in thought, Damien appeared at her side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "You seem deep in thought," he said softly, his dark eyes gleaming with affection. Isabella smiled, leaning into his touch. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," she admitted. "About how much has changed." Damien's gaze softened, and he nodded. "It's been a journey," he said quietly. "But I wouldn't change any of it." Isabella's heart swelled at his words. She had never imagined that this was where her life would lead her, but now, standing here with Damien, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. This was her home now, Midnight, Damien, and the life they were building together. "Do you ever think about the future?" Isabella asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. Damien glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it." Isabella's breath caught in her throat at the honesty in his words. She had never been one to dwell on the future, she had always been focused on the present, on achieving her goals, on maintaining control. But now, with Damien by her side, the future didn't seem so daunting. It felt like something they could face together, no matter what it held. "I'm not afraid of it either," Isabella said softly, her gaze locking onto his. "As long as I'm with you." Damien's lips curved into a slow, tender smile, and he reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You'll always be with me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what." Isabella's heart raced at the intensity of his words, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest, filling her with a quiet sense of certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles they would face them together. And that was all that mattered. As the night wore on, Isabella and Damien found themselves retreating to one of the private rooms in the club, the quiet intimacy of the space enveloping them like a warm embrace. They sat together on a plush velvet couch, their hands intertwined, their bodies close, the soft glow of candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. "I never thought I'd find something like this," Isabella admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien glanced at her, his expression softening. "Something like what?" Isabella smiled faintly, her fingers gently tracing the outline of his hand. "This," she said softly. "Us. Midnight. All of it." Damien's gaze darkened with emotion, and he leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Neither did I," he whispered. "But now that I have, I don't ever want to let it go." Isabella's chest tightened with emotion at the weight of his words. There was something so raw, so vulnerable about the way he spoke, and it filled her with a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had come into her life and changed everything. "You don't have to let it go," Isabella said softly, her voice steady. "We don't have to let any of this go." Damien smiled, his dark eyes gleaming with quiet affection. "I know," he whispered. "And I won't." They sat in silence for a long moment, their breaths mingling in the quiet intimacy of the room. There was no need for words now, everything they needed to say had already been spoken. They had found each other in the most unexpected of ways, and now, together, they had built something beautiful, something that went beyond the walls of midnight. Finally, Damien broke the silence, his voice low and filled with warmth. "I've been thinking about something." Isabella glanced at him, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Damien hesitated for a moment, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "I want to take midnight to the next level," he said softly. "I want to open it up to more people, to make it a place where even more can find the freedom we've discovered here." Isabella's heart swelled at the idea. She had seen firsthand the impact midnight had on the people who came through its doors, and the thought of expanding that reach, of helping even more people, filled her with a quiet sense of purpose. "That sounds incredible," she said, her voice filled with quiet enthusiasm. Damien smiled, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I think we can make it happen," he said. "Together." Isabella's pulse quickened at the thought of what the future could hold, what they could build together. Midnight had already changed so many lives, but now, with Damien's vision and her newfound strength, they could make it even more. They could create something that would outlast them both, something that would leave a lasting impact on the world. "I'm with you," Isabella said softly, her voice steady with conviction. "Whatever it takes." Damien's gaze softened, and he leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was filled with the weight of everything they had shared. It was slow, tender, and filled with the promise of the future they were building together. When they pulled away, breathless and flushed, Damien rested his forehead against hers, his voice a low murmur. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible, Isabella." Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with affection. "You've given me everything." And in that moment, as they sat together in the quiet intimacy of the room, Isabella knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Midnight had brought them together, but it was their love, their trust, that would carry them forward into the unknown. The future was wide open, filled with endless possibilities. And for the first time, Isabella wasn't afraid. She was ready.